Happy Friday to you. Hope you're doing absolutely great. Today, we are going to continue with our 15 priorities. And I want to focus today on the fact that due to recent amalgamation here in the Municipal District of St. Stephen, as mandated by the province, we have to remember and take into account that we are made up of two very different wards, as we call them. In regular language, that would just be like sections or segments of our municipality. We are composed of an urban ward, which you could just call kind of town living, and a rural ward, which you could just kind of call country living. And it's important to understand that if you are in the urban ward, if you live kind of in town, St. Stephen or Milltown, by the older boundaries that pre-existed before amalgamation, 2022, then life kind of didn't change for you. You are used to the fact of bylaws. You are used to a certain tax rate on your property assessment. And you can just go on living without even noticing that amalgamation even happened. However, if you are in that rural ward, formerly Ward 1 and 3, the urban ward is Ward 2 and remains Ward 2. We have been comprised since amalgamation of 3 wards, 1, 3, and then again 2 is the urban. So 1 and 3 were considered that rural ward. And now it is just going to be changed again, and has been just very recently, to, I kind of mean in our regular understanding, Ward 1 is the rural or country ward, and Ward 2 is the urban or kind of town ward. Now, it is important to understand that those who are in that rural ward have absolutely felt the effects of amalgamation. So it just kind of goes to show that those of us, I live on Churchill Street, kind of by the Tim Hortons here, I intentionally, when I moved here, chose to live in the town area because I am raising 2 kids with my wife. I wanted them to walk to school. I wanted them to walk to the Garcelon Civic Center, to the riverfront. This is the kind of values that I had when I moved here from a larger city. And that was a huge part of quality of life for me, is not to have to drive around. I wanted to walk, I wanted to bike, I wanted to be able to use those services. And as a result, property taxes do reflect that. Those services that we use, the library, for example, that is largely funded by the province in terms of operation, but in terms of the building and the maintenance and that land, that is a municipal endeavor. The Garcelon Civic Center, that is recreation is our second highest budget item as a municipality. The Garcelon Civic Center is a huge part of that, around $2.5 million. And I chose to be very close to that facility. And of course, the schools, same thing. So that's provincial. But the urban tax rate reflects those kinds of services that we pay for, whereas the rural ward, a lot of folks chose to settle out there. You talk to somebody, I decided not to live in town. I decided to live in the rural ward because they wanted that country living. It was formerly just kind of a local service district with very little regulation and bylaws. And then because of provincial regulation, the last provincial government, all these service districts or rural areas were incorporated into, were kind of annexed with the nearest municipalities. I'm saying all this because it's important to know that people who live in the urban ward chose that and that lifestyle and perhaps that higher tax rate, and people who live in the rural ward saw a change in their lifestyle, perhaps, in the sense that they are now regulated by and kind of subject to the zoning bylaw. Again, if you're in the rural ward, you may never have heard of this. If you're in the urban ward, it's easy to mix those up. You may never have even heard of this, but in the rural ward, when this was coming into effect late last year, and it was a very open consultation process, multiple readings, people in the rural ward having a chance for input, this was something that folks in the rural ward were very, very interested in. Last night, this might seem like a change of channel, but I'm going to bring it back in. Last night was a Meet the Candidates event in the rural ward at Oak Bay Hall. And it was fantastic to see all of the people who came out from the rural ward. Now, what's most impressive about this is that this is business as usual for that rural ward. They have been having committees like this on a regular basis, led by a Ward 3 committee, it was called. Now, again, if you're paying attention, that's now Ward 1 committee now. And they have been meeting regularly, every couple months, every 2-3 months, for the counselor there who is organizing it, Wade Greenlaw. There's a Ward 1, I almost said 3, there's a Ward 1 committee now. Chandra Best, Barb Tucker, and Wade Greenlaw was the counselor. And as a committee, they have kind of funded turning the lights on and having these events, renting the hall, and they kind of put on an event where Wade, the counselor, has been sharing updates of what the municipality is doing, whether that's tax rates, whether that's zoning bylaws, whether that's things that affect the residents of the rural ward. And this is absolutely fantastic. It's kind of strange to me how some have considered this controversial. Like, what are they doing in Ward 3? Why are they having their own event? That kind of thing. This is exactly the kind of thing that I want to see more of and do more of, perhaps in other places in the rural wards. We need to have this kind of dialogue, this kind of information sharing, this kind of face-to-face interaction and engagement to hear precisely how, when you have amalgamation and when you have our Southwest Service Commission mandated to create a zoning bylaw and a municipal plan, we need to hear how these things affect people's real lives on the ground. And without getting too into the weeds here, the zoning bylaw does have stipulations around bylaws for the rural ward, specifically what kind of structure you can put up, what kind of farming you can conduct. Some of it is grandfathered in, but the concern of any bylaw, of course, is really how you live with your neighbors, first of all, and making sure any structures are safe, second of all. And so, listening to rural folks in the rural ward, again, if you're in the urban ward, you might not think about this at all. But listening to folks in the rural ward, as I've knocked on doors and gotten a chance to hear the the counselor candidates. There are currently 5 in the rural ward. 3 will be elected to the next council. Their concerns, their issues, things that they experience as they live in the rural ward, they are a great source of understanding what residents are saying, because they will ultimately be representing those concerns at the table. And last night when I spoke at this event in the rural ward, because all the 3 mayoral candidates got to speak, as well as each of the rural candidates, it really struck me how the values of the rural ward come forward in a way in each of the candidates. So I kind of centered on 5 particular foci, I'm going to say focuses, of the rural residents. I mean, the first one ultimately is just fairness and making sure that residents in the rural ward only pay taxes on the services they use. So, for example, everyone in the rural ward, like 99% of properties, have their own septic system, their own water delivery, their own well, and it is important to make sure that they do not pay for water, the water system that we use and enjoy that come out of our taps in the urban ward. And so that's an example of something that is a higher cost, owning a septic system and being in charge of your own potable water in the rural ward. And the tax rate reflects that. As I've knocked on doors, some people in the rural ward had no idea kind of how amalgamation affected them. Some of them said, well, I don't know why I'm paying the same. And again, I would say to them, oh no, you're actually paying 56 cents per $100 on your assessed property value, whereas in the urban ward, like myself, I pay $1.56 per $100 of assessment on my property value. So there is a difference there. We have to maintain roads and we have more intense services. What What is paid for in the rural ward, of course, is, your police service, your fire service, part of the administration of the municipality. Any planning costs, there's a lot of planning costs that we share with the Southwest Service Commission, so those are shared as well. But things like roads, the roads in the urban area are the pavement, the resurfacing, the maintenance, the plowing. That is a municipal cost, whereas in the rural, that is a provincial responsibility, the plowing, the maintaining of the road. But speaking of roads, it has been very difficult for some councillors. Here, if you live in town, we'll start saying, because urban-rural starts to sound very difficult to get out. If you live in town, you can call your councillor, or you can call the town officer, do E11 on the website, and report a terrible pothole or something that needs to be fixed, and the municipality is responsible for that. Whereas in the rural ward outside of town, it's actually the province who's responsible for those areas of the roads. And we have heard of residents, and I was talking to Councillor candidate Cornish, former Councillor Brian Cornish, current councillor, running again, talking about how he called the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, the province, and said, my residents are concerned, the residents in my ward who I represent are concerned about some of the infrastructure here. And they told him, well, you can't just call us as a councillor. And I mean, if the province is saying they're in charge of the roads in the rural ward, then absolutely a councillor should be able to report that. So, what Councillor Cornish told me he's done is just gone and talked to crews when he sees them out, and actually points to an area, gives them a location of something that needs to be worked on, and they're actually pretty good at going and doing that. But that's an example of kind of the bureaucracy that isn't matching amalgamation and the priorities that we need to place around that in terms of contacting the right people and getting things done. Another priority that I see in the councillors' candidates, but that's reflected in rural residents, is concerns around structures, proper structures that they can build on a piece of land. So, for example, if you have a piece of land, there are stipulations in the zoning bylaw of what you can and can't build. You need to have a dwelling. You can build an accessory unit, something like a storage shed, but you can't start living inside it. This is according to the bylaw. Now, again, you can think of why planners and municipalities are concerned about this. If you have somebody living in something that was designed to be a shed and they decide to start living out there permanently, that can lead to all kinds of safety issues. And of course, if you start putting multiple such sheds out, well, then a piece of property can start becoming kind of a makeshift campground that is unsafe, leads to all kinds of hazards, let alone unsightly premises. If a neighbor next door starts to see, 10, 20 of these shacks going up and people living in and out of them, which I did encounter when I was running for MLA. People were saying some properties are being used as encampments, before we had the shelter and people who could get services in town and that kind of thing. People were using some properties as encampments, and the bylaw officer, the municipality, needs to be able to enforce some kind of regulation. If there's no regulations, then there's nothing to enforce. And so I am a huge proponent of incremental sustainable development. So I think, there should be permitted, something very small, something like a tiny home, something like even a shack, as long as it meets minimum dwelling standards for safety. So instead of saying, well, it needs to be a minimum square footage size to be considered a dwelling, I think a very, very tiny home should be able to be put on certain size acreage. Of course, there's usually size of the lot depends on this. But I am a huge proponent, as I've said, for in town as well. We need to allow, again, for incremental development. Start as small as you can. So any kind of starter dwelling structure, I believe, should be permitted on any kind of lot, and then you can expand out. I've said before, I live in a 140-year-old house here on Churchill Street, and you can clearly see how it started, and then the development, and then the renovation, and then the addition. And the house is kind of a hodgepodge. It's a wonderful 2,400 square foot house now, but it certainly didn't start that way. And that is how we allow people to, in this economy and in this housing crisis, allow people to grow. So that is something I'm interested in being mayor, is with the council, making sure that in the rural ward we can have that kind of sustainable growth and have small dwellings on land to make sure that people who want to use their land in that way are not adversely affected. I also talked about communication in the rural ward, and we see this. I mean, one of my absolute priorities as mayor is to communicate, as I'm doing now. And you see how, I mean, the committee, the Ward 1 committee is an example of this, getting information out, getting people in a room, sharing exactly what's happening, taking questions. That is a value. Rural people, as I knock on doors, our rural residents say, we want to know what's going on better. And it is incumbent on us as a municipality, especially a council, to share how decisions are being made. I want to see a more transparent website. I want to see town halls. I want to see ward town halls, whether that's specifically for Ward 2 or specifically for Ward 1, and that kind of thing, because getting communication out there is extremely important. And I also finally want to see very little limitations on farming. And there's a councillor candidate who's currently actually a farmer, so feels the effects of that. What does somebody like me in Ward 2 know about farming? Not very much. But I am extremely interested in this. I ran as MLA on more farming in our wards, whether that's municipal wards or local service districts. We need to see agricultural activity happening, if for no other reason than the cost of food. And so, of course, again, if you're living next to somebody who, doesn't want to see suddenly a commercial pig farm pop up right next door on the other side of their fence, there needs to be some regulation around that. But we don't want to see that limiting proper agricultural activity that conforms to the agriculture operation practices of New Brunswick. So as long as you're conforming to those, then we need to allow that kind of agricultural activity in the rural wards. And I will say again, through the Planning Review and Adjustment Committee, PRAC, neighbors can always go there and ask for a variance, especially when they agree on, if maybe there is a pig farm next door and that pig farmer talked to their neighbor and said, hey, do you mind? And maybe they've made some sort of arrangement. They can actually go to the PRAC and ask for a variance and say, we know that this doesn't exactly meet all the standards of this, but we have made an agreement that it's okay. And very often that board will allow for that. This video is getting long. All that to say, as a municipality, we want to see value number 10 of the municipal plan is literally, and I'll read it to you here, protect rural freedoms. There's kind of 10 mandates of the municipal plan to protect rural freedoms and promote agricultural development and support local farms. So that is in here as part of the plan. And as long as this document, the zoning bylaw, is about protecting those freedoms, allowing some regulation so that bylaw officers can enforce if neighbors get upset, but then remembering there is that variance mechanism. We all live in this beautiful place together, whether you're in town, whether you are in the rural ward. We need to remember that we are neighbors. We each chose to live in this place for a reason, for our own particular reasons, and that is why when we live together, we have that shared value of what makes St. Stephen great, but also the ways that we are different, and we need to respect that with each other. All right, this was the longest one yet. Have a wonderful Friday, friends, and I will see you tomorrow. I'm at the airport, Run the Runway 5K tomorrow. You can jump in on that still. I know they're looking for volunteers, and you can register tonight as a runner, I think, until 6 o'clock. So I will see you there tomorrow, and of course, I'll see you back here for another video. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow. BuildUpStStephen.ca, that's my website. Check it out for more. Cheers.